even though I'm going to be holding up pictures during this video, I think it's still going to be a lot more interesting and entertaining than a PowerPoint, especially if my cat is jumping on some of these pictures while I'm trying to show them to you. The 6.5 centuries between the end of Roman rule and the Norman conquest are among the most important in British history. The long period is also known as one of the most challenging to understand, which is why it is traditionally labeled as the Dark Ages. Lots of blood, lots of death going on here. So we have Duke William of Normandy's resounding triumph over King Harold at the Battle of the Hastings in 1066 marked the dawn of the new era. And while this new era was going on, the overthrow of the Saxon Kingdom of England was to transform the country the Normans conquered from how it was organized and governed to its language and its customs, and perhaps even most visibly today, its architecture, which still exists today. Here's William I seated on his throne. And what this is that you're looking at, it's depicted in the late 12th century battle chronicle written by the monks of Battle Abbey. William and his knights in the castles they built transformed England and helped impose Norman rule. Norman clergy dominated the church, and the monasteries and churches were constructed in the new Romanesque and Norman style of architecture. So as you see some of the architecture in this video today, you'll see what I'm talking about. And some of these structures actually exist today. While this was going on, we have the Crusades. They began in 1095, in which many Englishmen took part, though ultimately unsuccessful in their stated goal of wresting Jerusalem and its Islamic rulers. The Crusades had a profound impact on many aspects of life and thought in Western Europe. Returning Crusaders brought back from their travels new ideas about architecture, health, and science. Their belief in prayer, for most people, however, the parish church was the focus of religious life. Here they heard Mass each Sunday and celebrated the many saints' days and festivals interwoven with daily life and the agricultural year. Let's talk about William's youngest son, Henry I. You'll see there was a lot of interesting changes of rule during this time. So he brought peace to both administrative and legal reform, but the country descended into chaos and civil war when Henry's nephew, Stephen, was crowned king, despite the rival claim of Henry's daughter, Matilda. So now it sounds like a little bit of a soap opera here. Order was restored by Matilda's son, Henry II, a monarch of boundless energy and ungovernable rages. He traveled constantly through the vast dominions stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The many fortresses he raised included Dover Castle. And here's an example of Dover Castle, which is its most important structure during this time period that we're talking about. So Dover Castle was rebuilt partly as a stopover on the road to Canterbury. We're going to be reading the Canterbury Tales this semester. And the shrine of his turbulent priest, St. Thomas Becket, murdered in the cathedral by Henry's knights in 1170. Henry's later reign was clouded by the poor relationship he had with his sons and his wife. And when he died in France in 1189, he was at war with his eldest son, Richard, who had joined forces against him with the French king. You have a lot of rivalries here and a lot of family. So this reconstruction drawing here that you're seeing of the siege of Dover Castle in 1216, during the civil war between King John and his English barons, you're seeing French forces supporting John's enemy. They undermined the castle's northern defenses. So if that makes any sense whatsoever. Let's talk about pilgrimage. So you hear the term pilgrimage, and you're going to see what pilgrimage is. And here's just a nice little gorgeous image here just to get you in the mood. So when you're reading the Canterbury Tales in a couple of weeks, you're going to learn about they're all on a pilgrimage in this thing. So many people hope to achieve spiritual merit for cures of poor health by making pilgrimages to holy shrines. For others, like some of the tale tellers immortalized in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, pilgrimages were an excuse for an enjoyable outing. There wasn't much to do then. We didn't have technology back in the day, and not everybody was literate, so it wasn't like people could sit around and read books. So pilgrimages were kind of a thing to do. The goal of Chaucer's characters was the most renowned English shrine, that of St. Thomas Becket of Canterbury Cathedral, where he was martyred in 1170. Pilgrims flocked to it from all over Britain and Europe, and this was part of a wider pattern of pilgrimage across England, often to places claiming to house saints' relics. Those who disputed the church's teaching were seen as heretics, while other faiths were barely tolerated. So this is near and dear to my own heart. During anti-Semitic riots in 1190, the Jews of York took refuge in the royal castle. Many took their own lives instead of risking them with the mob outside and set fire to the castle. The few who survived were murdered by the rioters. A century later, Edward I expelled all Jews from England. Though many complained about the clergy, few in England openly questioned the church's teachings until the later 14th century. Then let's talk about this massacre at Clifford's Tower. This was one of the worst anti-Semitic massacres in the Middle Ages. It took place in York, again, in 1190. The city's entire Jewish community was trapped by an angry mob inside of this castle. Many members of the community chose to commit suicide rather to be murdered or forcibly baptized by the attackers. Here's an anti-Semitic portrayal of Jewish moneylenders from a 13th century transcript. Here's a beheading taking place here. And I also have another image that I'll show you in a minute as well to kind of depict that. So I'll show you some more images coming up here. What's happening, William I brought Jewish merchants to England to the 11th century, as they were able to lend money to the crown, whereas Christians were forbidden to do so. So all sorts of problematic things happening, and the Jewish community was at the crux of it. The coronation of Richard I from a 13th century manuscript. Here we go. A Jewish citizen from York was killed on the way back from the coronation in London. The events of 1190 are recorded in numerous accounts, though none were eyewitness reports, and most show strong prejudice against the Jews. The story recorded by William of Newburgh, an Augustinian canon from Yorkshire, tells of two Jewish citizens from York called Benedict and Josias. Together they traveled to London to attend the coronation of Richard I in 1189. Resentment about the presence of Jews at the coronation was fueled by anger about taxes to fund the Crusades, leading to riots at the ceremony itself and in Norwich, Stamford, York, and Lincoln. A false rumor was even put out there that the king had ordered a massacre of the Jews. Benedict was attacked and killed on his way back from York. This kept happening. The Jews were then trapped in the tower. Inside the tower, trust between the Jews and keeper broke down. And when he left the tower on some other business, they refused to allow him back in. They had now challenged the king's authority, and troops joined the mob outside, where they were pelted with stones from castle walls by the besieged Jews. Friday, the 16th of March, coincided with Shabbat Haggadol, which is the Great Shabbat, before the Jewish festival of Pesach or Passover. According to several accounts, the Jews realized that they could not hold out against their attackers, and rather than waiting to be killed or forcibly baptized, they decided to meet death together. The father of each family killed his wife and his children before taking his own life. Isn't that sad? It's just absolutely despicable. Just before their deaths, they also set fire to their possessions they had brought with them. This fire consumed the timber tower, and it's not clear how many Jews were present. They're estimating a range from 20 to 40 families, and later account in Hebrew suggests about 150 people, which may not really seem like that major of a deal, but it's pretty big. That's the only Jewish people at the time. So, yeah. One of the mob's ringleaders, Richard Malabis, had offered safe passage to any Jews who agreed to convert and leave the tower, but a few were the only ones that took this option, only to be murdered as soon as they came out from the burning building. Afterwards, the rioters destroyed the records of deaths to the Jews, which had been placed in safekeeping at York Minster. The triggers for the massacre were many. The calls to crusade in the Holy Land made many Christians sensitive to the presence of non-Christians in England. These feelings may have been heightened by the approaching celebrations for Easter, when the church preached that the Jews had connived at the death of Jesus. Some rioters also saw the possibility of cleaning themselves of deaths to the Jews. So a lot of death. The Dark Ages wasn't just about killing royalty, but all sorts of things happened. Skipping to Richard I. So Richard I was in reign from 1189 to 99. He's also known as Richard the Lionheart. Was always abroad or on a crusade. His younger brother John was forced by his barons to sign Magna Carta. Magna Carta is also known as the Great Charter, and this was intended to limit his powers in 1215, but ultimately he ignored it. His barons invited Prince Louis of France to invade in May of 1216. John died in October 1216 with his 9-year-old son Henry assuming the throne in the midst of the French invasion. Imagine you're being told what to do by a 9-year-old. So Louis conquered almost all of southeastern England, but retreated in 1217 after defeats of the Battle of Sandwich. Here is, let me see if I could find a picture of what's going on in Westminster Abbey. I can't, but here's the Massacre of the Jews is a picture that I have. So we'll just go with it. That's really the only picture I have for the remainder of this video, unfortunately. I thought I had more with me, but we'll just sort of go with it. So here's what's happening in a nutshell with all of these monarchs and all this stuff going on. The long reign of Henry III saw further unrest from the late 1250s, headed by Simon de Montfort. But after de Montfort's death at the Battle of Evesham, which was 1265, and the long siege of Kenilworth Castle, Warwickshire rebellion was finally suppressed. This was the time when chivalry blossomed, and you hear about all those legends of King Arthur, and they later on found out that King Arthur and the Round Table was really a myth. There was no King Arthur that really existed in real life. Edward I, another great castle builder, united his barons behind the conquest of Wales and his attempts on Scotland. His Scottish policy proved disastrous for his son Edward II. From 1307 to 1327 was his reign, and his defeat at Bannockburn was followed by Scots raids far south of the border. So then what happens after this is the king's devotion to his low-born favorites, Piers Gaveston, and then the Despencer family enraged his barons. I thought I had a Piers Gaveston. Here it is. Piers Gaveston, yes. And his downfall and the downfall of Edward II. Where was I in this long tale? Okay, so when Edward's wife Isabella and her lover, this is a great one too. So Edward's wife was having an affair, and her lover Roger Mortimer invaded in 1326 from France. They quickly gained support. Edward was forced to renounce his throne in favor of his 14-year-old son, now a teenager's telling people what to do, and almost certainly brutally murdered at Berkeley Castle in it's pronounced Gloucestershire. So you see it looks like it says Gloucestershire, but it's Gloucestershire. Although Isabella and Mortimer initially governed Edward III from 1327 to 77, he assumed control in his own right in 1330, and he ousted his mother and executed her lover. These were great people. Edward was a great warrior king, winning victories in France and during the early years of what was later known as the 100 Years' War. His armies included archers using longbows, which became the dominant English weapon of the later Middle Ages. Church, and let me tell you about church a little bit here. So monasteries and churches flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries. New religious foundations such as the almshouses and hospitals cared for the poor and the sick. Towns grew in size and autonomy as the old divisions between Normans and the English began to finally break down. English began to replace Norman French as the dominant language, and commerce developed, helped to better coinage and the growth of the wool trade. But the growth of a money-based economy began to put the old feudal order under pressure. Then, as if that's not enough, in 1348 to 1349, the established order and the population were struck a devastating blow by the Black Death, also known as the Black Plague, which killed between a third and a half of England's population. The most immediate of its many effects was an acute labor shortage. Survivors demanded higher wages, and bondmen refused to do unpaid service for feudal masters. Attempts to fix wages and prices at pre-plague rates only increased resentment. Edward III's grandson and successor, Richard III, inherited a bankrupt treasury and discontent over reverses in the conflicts with France. In 1381, simmering grievances erupted into the peasants' revolt. Then, the feudal system was not only institution it was not the only institution being challenged. So for the very first time in English history, the doctrines as well as the actions of the church, everything was being attacked at the time. Yet still religion remained all pervasive in daily life, though the focus of piety changed from monasteries to parish churches. Many people sought salvation by paying to have prayers said for them in chapels and undertaking pilgrimages, as we were talking about pilgrimages earlier. Then there was all sorts of stuff going on in 1399, Richard II was deposed and murdered by Henry IV. This would be considered the first of many upheavals to afflict the monarchy during this period. It wasn't just during that period. This takes place in pretty much all of British history. People are killing each other for power, for leadership. Really nice people, again. Yeah. Though assailed from many quarters, Henry held onto his throne, and his Lancastrian dynasty was reprieved by the achievements of his son. And you've probably heard of this guy. Sorry about that. I just had to grab something to drink real quick here. The greatest of all English warriors was Henry V, his son. And Henry V reigned from 1413 to 1422. He won a startling victory over the French in Agincourt in 1415, achieved largely thanks to the all-conquering English longbow. By the time of his premature death, he was ruling half of France. And then, last but not least, right before the Tudors were in order, so this was called the Wars of the Roses. More dangerous was the increasingly fashionable expression of power and status through the recruiting of private armies. These contributed to the breakdown of order as Henry VI had two different reigns. The first was 1422 to 61. The second was 1470 to 71. Kind of strange, I know. Proved incompetent to rule, and rival aristocratic, I can't speak anymore because I was so thirsty, yeah, and rival aristocratic factions contended to control both monarch and kingdom. Those feuds developed into a series of short campaigns and often bloody battles, fought at intervals between 1455 and 1485, which the crown charged hands 6 times. Okay, so where are we going with this next? And one more thing. Yeah, so the Yorkist Edward IV eventually emerged as victorious. But his brother Richard III, you've probably heard a lot of these names, and you don't have to write them all down because it's quite confusing. But Richard III alienated supporters by seizing the throne from his nephew Edward V. Richard was defeated and killed at Bosworth by the Tudor. You've heard of the Tudors. So the Lancastrian heir's name was Henry Tudor, and he's the one that killed Richard, and that's when the Tudors started to reign. That is the end of this part of your lesson.